In a busy train station, people rushed from one platform to another, lost in their own thoughts. The announcements echoed through the hall, and the sound of rolling suitcases filled the air. Near a corner of this noisy place stood an old wooden piano. Its paint was chipped, and many keys looked worn and uneven. Most people hardly noticed it anymore. It was just part of the background, forgotten, like many things in the station. But every afternoon, just before sunset, a young woman would come and sit on the piano bench. Her name was Sophie. She was quiet and gentle, with soft features and a calm expression. Her hair was tied loosely, and she wore simple clothes that made her blend in. Sophie never asked for money. She placed no tip jar, no sign. She simply sat, rested her fingers on the keys, and sometimes just stared at them for a long time. People passed by without stopping. Some glanced at her for a second, then went back to their phones or conversations. For weeks she sat there without playing a single note. To the regular commuters, she was invisible. Some even whispered that maybe she didn't know how to play. Others felt sorry for her but didn't have time to care. One evening, as the sun's golden light slipped through the high windows, Sophie gently pressed one key. A soft sound floated into the air. It was so quiet that no one really noticed at first, but then she pressed another key, and another. Slowly, she began to play. Her hands moved with care, as if she was remembering each note from somewhere deep inside. The melody she played was strange and beautiful. It was sad but comforting at the same time, almost like a memory that you couldn't quite reach but still felt in your heart. People nearest to the piano slowed down. A few stopped, curious. A woman holding a coffee cup froze, listening carefully. A man who had been talking loudly on the phone lowered his voice and turned towards Sophie. The sound of the station seemed to fade as more people began to gather around her. No one expected this quiet girl to create such a beautiful sound. The notes seemed to touch something inside them that they didn't even know was there. Some of the older people in the crowd looked emotional. One elderly man took off his hat and wiped his eyes. He whispered to the woman beside him, "I haven't heard this song in years. I thought it was gone." But no one really knew what song it was. The melody didn't seem familiar to most, yet it felt like it belonged to everyone. It was as if Sophie was telling a story without using any words. For the first time, people who rushed through that station every day began to notice the old piano again. They noticed the way Sophie gently touched each key, the way she closed her eyes as she played, the way she seemed lost in the music. Sophie's face remained calm, but inside, her emotions swirled. She remembered how her grandfather had played this same melody when she was a child. He had called it the forgotten melody because no one else knew it but him. Now she was sharing it with the world, quietly and gently, not for attention or praise, but because she felt it needed to be heard. As the last note faded, there was a long moment of silence. Then something unexpected happened. A woman in the crowd began to cry. Soon others wiped their eyes, and some even hugged strangers next to them. No one really understood why this simple melody made them feel so deeply, but it did, and as Sophie sat at the piano, she finally felt that someone was listening, even if no words were spoken. From that day on, Sophie wasn't invisible anymore. But she didn't smile or wave. She simply packed her things, placed her hands on the piano once more, and left. The crowd slowly drifted away, but their hearts felt lighter, even if they couldn't explain why. The girl no one noticed had played something they would never forget. The old wooden piano sat quietly in its corner of the train station. Its surface was scratched, and its paint faded from years of being touched and forgotten. Many travelers passed by it every day without a second glance. For most, it was just an old object left behind, like a memory no one cared about anymore. But for Sophie, that piano meant something special. Every morning before the station grew busy, she would visit the piano. She brought a soft cloth with her to gently wipe the dust off its keys. She ran her fingers carefully along the worn wood as if she was greeting an old friend. There was no one watching her at that hour. No crowds, no cameras, just her and the piano. She would often sit quietly, staring at it for several minutes before placing her hands on the keys. Sometimes she would press a single note and listen as the sound echoed in the empty station. Other times she said nothing at all, just sitting there, lost in her thoughts. This piano had been in the station for many years. Long ago, it had been a beautiful instrument, shining and new. People once gathered around it to listen to songs played by travelers and musicians. It had filled the station with music and laughter, but times changed. The piano had been moved to a corner, forgotten. As commuters grew busier and life grew faster, over time, its surface became dull, and several of its keys no longer worked properly. Yet Sophie saw beauty in it. She didn't mind the broken keys or the chipped wood. To her, the piano was perfect. There was a deeper reason why she loved this instrument. When Sophie was a little girl, she had visited this station many times with her grandfather. He would lift her onto the piano bench and guide her tiny fingers across the keys, teaching her simple melodies. He often told her that music could speak when words could not. Those moments were among her happiest memories. After her grandfather passed away, Sophie hadn't touched a piano for a long time, but one day, while passing through the station, she had noticed the old piano still sitting there, forgotten. Something inside her felt drawn to it, as if it was waiting for her. That was why she came back every day, not for fame or attention, but because this piano reminded her of love, warmth, and family. As the days passed after her first performance, more and more people began noticing her. Some would gather around the piano even before she began to play, waiting quietly. Others would take out their phones and record her music, sharing it with friends and online. But Sophie didn't seem to care about any of that. She remained quiet and focused only on the piano. One afternoon, as the station grew busy, a boy walked up to her while she sat at the piano. He stood silently for a moment before placing a small flower on top of the piano. Sophie looked up and gave him a gentle nod, but she didn't speak. The boy's mother joined him and whispered, "Thank you for your music. It reminds me of my father." Her eyes glistened with tears, but there was a warm smile on her face. A small gesture made Sophie's heart feel full. For the first time in a long while, she felt connected to the people around her, even without words. In the following days, more people began leaving small gifts, flowers, letters, even drawings, on or near the piano. It became a place where people paused and reflected, a break from the rush of life. The station workers also began to notice the change. The piano, once dusty and ignored, now seemed to shine with life again. Even those who worked there every day felt a difference. They heard laughter, saw hugs, and watched strangers comforting each other near the piano. Sophie didn't play long concerts. Her performances were short and simple, but they touched something deep in the hearts of everyone who stopped to listen. Each note she played carried feelings of hope, sadness, memory, and healing. It was as if her fingers could reach into people's hearts and remind them of things they had forgotten, of lost loved ones, childhood moments, and quiet happiness. Even though Sophie never spoke, her music told stories, and in this busy train station, surrounded by noise and hurry, her quiet songs created a space where people could feel something real again. The piano itself seemed to wake up from a long sleep. As Sophie's fingers moved across its keys, the old wood glowed warmly. In the light, its sounds, though imperfect and sometimes out of tune, carried a beauty that touched everyone. This was no longer just an abandoned piano. It was a place of connection, healing, and quiet understanding. And every day, as Sophie sat down to play, more people gathered, not just to listen but to feel. In that forgotten corner of the station, something special was happening, and it all started with a girl and an old piano. Every day, more people came to the station just to hear Sophie play. Some came early to find a good spot to stand near the piano. Others who didn't even need to catch a train would stop by just to listen. The quiet corner where the piano sat was no longer empty, but still, Sophie remained a mystery to everyone. She never spoke, never smiled much, and never stayed long after her performance. She would sit, play her melody, then quietly stand and leave. What made her music so special? No one could say exactly. It wasn't loud or flashy. It wasn't fast or complicated. But it had something honest and raw, something that went straight into people's hearts. One afternoon, while Sophie was playing, an elderly man in a brown coat appeared. His steps were slow and careful. He carried a small wooden cane, but his hands trembled slightly as he held it. He moved through the crowd until he stood close to the piano. His eyes stayed fixed on Sophie's fingers as they glided gently across the keys. The moment he heard the melody, his face changed. Tears filled his eyes, and his lips trembled as if he wanted to speak but couldn't. After Sophie finished that day's piece and stood to leave, the old man spoke for the first time, though his voice was soft and almost shaky. "Where did you learn that song?" he asked. Sophie paused. Her eyes met his for a moment, and though she didn't answer with words, her face softened. The old man whispered again, "That's not just any song. That was my friend's melody long ago. He used to play it during difficult times." Some people nearby heard this and turned their heads in surprise. The song Sophie had been playing was unknown to almost everyone, yet here was this man claiming to know its history. He explained gently to those around him that during a time of war, many years ago, his close friend had composed that same melody, but his friend never published it, never recorded it. The music had been shared only among a few people, and over time it was lost. How could Sophie know it? How could she play it exactly the same? Sophie didn't speak, but she gently reached into her worn bag and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was old and yellow with time, and the edges were torn. She opened it carefully, showing handwritten notes on a music sheet. The old man's eyes widened. "That's it," he whispered. "That's his handwriting." The crowd leaned closer, curious. Sophie's connection to this forgotten melody was no accident. When she was a child, she had found this music tucked inside a wooden box at her grandfather's house. Her grandfather never spoke much about it, but Sophie knew it had meant something important to him. After he passed away, she kept the sheet hidden for many years. One day, feeling lost and lonely, she found it again and decided to learn it on her own. It wasn't just a song for Sophie. It was a link to the past. A message from a time and a man she never knew but felt connected to anyway. As people began to understand the story behind the music, the meaning of Sophie's performance became even deeper. This was not just about a girl sitting at an old piano. This was about memory, history, and a piece of music that almost disappeared forever. After that day, the old man came back often to listen. He never missed a performance, and every time Sophie played the forgotten melody, he stood quietly near the piano, closing his eyes and listening with his whole heart. Other people who heard the story also returned. Some said they felt the music reminded them of their grandparents, or of stories they had heard about hard times and lost loves. The melody seemed to stir feelings that words could never explain. Somehow, Sophie, without saying anything, had given a gift to everyone who stopped to listen. Her music made people feel connected, not only to their own memories but to each other. In a world where many people rushed past each other without a second glance, Sophie's music made them pause, reflect, and feel together. Even though she played the same melody again and again, no one ever got tired of hearing it. Each time felt new, as if she was speaking directly to every single person standing near the piano. For Sophie, this was not about fame or applause. She simply wanted to keep the melody alive, and without realizing it, she was helping people heal too. As days passed, something unexpected began to happen. A young man who had recorded Sophie's playing on his phone uploaded the video to a popular social media site. At first, only a few people noticed it, but within hours it began to spread. People shared it with their friends, then their friends shared it too. By the next morning, the video had gone viral. The comments were filled with emotional words. Many people wrote about how the melody made them cry, even though they didn't know why. Others said they felt comforted by the music, like it healed something deep inside them. People from different parts of the country began coming to the train station. Some took long train rides just to hear Sophie play in person. Every day, when Sophie arrived, a small crowd was already waiting. Cameras and phones were pointed at her, ready to record every note. But Sophie stayed the same. She didn't look at the cameras or smile for pictures. She simply sat at the piano, placed her hands on the keys, and played. She still played the same melody, the forgotten melody, slow, gentle, and full of feeling. For those who watched online, Sophie became a symbol of something pure and real. In a noisy world filled with distractions, her quiet music brought peace. Some people left comments saying her playing made them remember lost loved ones. Others said it helped them through hard times. A few even shared that they hadn't cried in years but couldn't hold back tears when they heard her song. At the station, the space around the piano began to change. Where once there had been dust and trash, now flowers and small notes covered the area. Children sat on the floor, listening carefully. Parents held their children close as they watched Sophie play. Station workers cleaned the piano every morning before Sophie arrived. They even placed a small bench nearby so elderly visitors could sit while they listened. It was as if the entire train station was slowly transforming into something softer, kinder. But Sophie herself stayed quiet. She never explained where she had learned the song, never gave interviews, and never spoke a word to reporters who gathered near the piano each day. Her silence added to the mystery. People couldn't understand why she didn't speak, but somehow, that made them listen even more. Her music did the talking, and that was enough. One evening, as Sophie was playing, a woman stepped forward from the crowd. She held a small notebook in her hands and waited until Sophie finished her piece. When the music ended, the woman gently placed the notebook on the piano and said, softly, "This was my mother's diary. She used to write about a melody that made her feel peaceful. I think this was the song. Thank you for bringing it back." Sophie looked at the notebook for a moment, then gave a small nod before carefully closing the piano lid. After that, more visitors began leaving small gifts and letters on or near the piano. It became a place where people left pieces of their own stories, pictures, notes, flowers, even little charms. Somehow, Sophie's quiet music had opened a space where people felt safe to share their feelings. And while many came just out of curiosity at first, almost everyone who stayed long enough to listen left with a full heart. Some left smiling, others wiping away tears. It didn't matter that Sophie never spoke. Her melody connected everyone in a way that words could not. By the end of the week, news outlets began running stories about her. Headlines called her the silent pianist and the girl who made the world cry. But Sophie ignored all of it. She didn't read the articles or watch the reports. For her, this was never about attention or fame. She just came every day, sat at the piano, and played the same melody. The piano, once old and forgotten, now glowed with life again. Its scratches and worn keys didn't matter. People saw beauty in it, just as Sophie did. And for the people passing through the station, this simple corner, who had become a place where they could stop, reflect, and feel something real. No one knew how long Sophie would keep coming, but as long as she did, the crowds would keep gathering, because in that busy, noisy train station, Sophie's quiet melody reminded them of something they had almost forgotten: the power of simple, honest music to touch the heart. The train station had become more than just a place to catch a train. Each afternoon, people gathered around the old piano, waiting quietly for Sophie to arrive. It didn't matter that she played the same melody again and again. For many, it felt different each time. The quiet melody seemed to hold stories that no one could explain. Some listeners felt peace, while others felt a deep sadness that made them cry. But one question remained in everyone's mind: where did this melody come from? Most had never heard it before. It wasn't a popular song or something from the radio. It felt like an old song that belonged to the past. Some reporters tried to research it, looking through music archives and asking older musicians, but they couldn't find a match. The melody remained a mystery, just like Sophie herself. Then one day, the elderly man who often stood near the piano returned. He had something new with him, an old photograph. As Sophie played, he held the photo gently in his hands and stared at her. When she finished, he stepped forward. The crowd grew quiet as he began to speak. His voice was soft but steady. "This melody," he said, "was written by a friend of mine a very long time ago. We served together during difficult times, and after the war, he wrote this song for his wife, but he never shared it widely. Only a few of us ever heard it. Over time, I thought it was forgotten." He held up the photograph for the crowd to see. It showed two young men in military uniforms, one of them holding a small notebook that looked very much like the one Sophie sometimes carried. He continued, "My friend's name was never known to the world as a famous composer, but this melody was his gift to those he loved." People listened closely, their faces full of emotion. The man turned to Sophie. "How did you find this song?" he asked gently. Sophie, as always, did not speak, but she reached into her bag and pulled out the worn sheet of music she had shown before. She held it carefully, showing it to the man. His eyes filled with tears as he looked at the familiar handwriting. For a moment, no one spoke. The station felt still. Then a soft smile appeared on the old man's face. "This is my friend's writing, there's no doubt, but how did it reach you?" he asked again. Sophie gently tapped her heart and then pointed upward. It was her quiet way of saying that it had come through family, through love, through memory. Slowly, bits of Sophie's past became clear to those who gathered regularly. Many years ago, her grandfather had served with the old man's friend. The two had been close, and at some point her grandfather had been given this melody as a gift or maybe a shared secret. Sophie had found the sheet hidden in a dusty old box after her grandfather passed away. Though she couldn't speak, she could understand its importance. She had taught herself to play the melody as a way to feel close to her grandfather again. But somehow, without even knowing the full history, she had carried this music back into the world. The melody itself was full of history, love, loss, hope, and memory, and that's why it touched people so deeply. It wasn't just music, it was a story without words. After that day, more people felt connected to Sophie's music. Even those who didn't know the full story could sense that something old and important was being shared. The station became a place where strangers gathered not just to listen, but to reflect. Some brought flowers for Sophie. Others left notes at the piano thanking her for helping them feel something they thought they had lost. Still, Sophie never asked for anything in return. She came quietly, played her song, and left quietly. Her silent presence made people listen more carefully. The elderly man became a regular figure near the piano. Whenever Sophie played, he stood nearby, listening with his eyes closed. Sometimes a single tear would roll down his cheek, but he always stayed until the last note faded. And so the story of the forgotten melody slowly became known. It was no longer a mystery tune played by a silent girl. It was a piece of history that had found its way back into the world through love. Sophie, that had brought it back, not with words but with music. The crowd didn't need explanations anymore. They came because the music spoke to them in ways they couldn't explain. Even people who didn't know the full story felt its truth. And each time Sophie sat at that old piano, she honored a melody that might have been lost forever. A melody that had traveled from one heart to another, across years, across generations, and now touched everyone who stopped to listen. The melody had taken over the train station in a way no one could have imagined. Every afternoon when Sophie arrived, people would begin to gather. Some came early to get a good place near the piano, while others just stood quietly, waiting for the first note. It didn't matter how busy the station was or how many trains came and went. The moment Sophie's fingers touched the piano keys, everything seemed to pause. Travelers who had been rushing to catch their trains would stop in their tracks. Workers in bright uniforms would stand quietly, leaning on their brooms or tools. Children would sit on the cold floor, wide-eyed listening. And as Sophie played the forgotten melody, the same thing happened every time. People cried. Some wiped away tears quickly, hoping no one would notice. Others didn't even try to hide it, letting the tears roll down their cheeks freely. There was something about the melody, slow, soft, and full of quiet sadness that reached deep into people's hearts. It touched feelings they didn't know they had. It made them think about loved ones they missed, moments they had forgotten, and feelings they had pushed aside for years. After hearing Sophie play, many people stayed behind, sitting near the piano long after she left. Some left flowers or small letters. Others just sat quietly, reflecting. One afternoon, a woman stood near the piano with her hand on her heart. When Sophie finished playing, she whispered, "This music, who helped me forgive someone I never thought I could forgive." Another day, an older man sat near the piano, and as tears filled his eyes, he said softly to no one in particular, "This melody reminds me of my wife. She passed away years ago, but I feel close to her when I hear this." The train station had become more than just a place for travel. It had become a place of healing. Even the workers at the station noticed the change. One security guard commented, "This corner used to feel cold and forgotten. Now it feels like a special place, like it has a soul." But through it all, Sophie stayed the same. She never spoke, never asked for money or attention. She never changed her routine. Every day she played the same melody, always with the same quiet care. And yet, no one grew tired of it. Somehow, hearing the same notes day after day didn't feel repetitive. Instead, it felt comforting, like visiting an old friend. Even people who had come only out of curiosity found themselves returning, drawn back by the way the music made them feel. A small community began to form around the piano. Strangers started to talk to one another. They shared their stories of loss, regret, love, and hope. The piano, once forgotten, had become a place where people connected not just to the music but to each other, and while no one really understood why Sophie didn't speak, they accepted it. Her silence became part of the experience. It made people listen more carefully. They noticed every detail, the way her fingers moved gently across the worn keys, the way she sometimes closed her eyes as she played, and the way her face stayed calm and peaceful. In a world filled with noise, Sophie's quiet presence was a gift. Even local musicians who visited the station felt moved by her playing. A guitarist who had been in the crowd one day later said, "Her music doesn't show off or demand attention. It just feels true." A pianist who came to listen said, "I've played more complicated pieces, but nothing I've ever played made me feel like this melody does." It wasn't about skill or fame or performance. It was about honesty. Sophie's music was simple and pure. It spoke straight to the heart. And so, day after day, the train station filled with people who wanted to feel something real, even if they didn't know why they cried. They understood that the music mattered, and in the middle of it all was Sophie, the quiet girl who said nothing, asked for nothing, and gave everything. Her melody, once almost lost to history, was now alive again, and with every note she played, she helped people feel less alone. The question everyone wondered about was simple but important. Why did Sophie never speak? People had watched her play day after day. They had seen her smile softly or nod gently when someone placed flowers or a note on the piano. But she never said a single word. Her silence made the experience feel more mysterious, but it also felt deeply personal. Some people guessed that Sophie was simply shy. Others thought maybe she didn't want to speak to avoid media attention. But the truth was different and much sadder. An older woman who worked at the station cafe began telling those who asked about Sophie's story. She had seen Sophie before anyone else paid attention to her, back when she sat at the piano for hours without playing even one note. One afternoon, while wiping tables, the woman gently shared what she knew. Sophie had once been full of life and energy. Her love of music came from her childhood, when her grandfather taught her how to play simple songs on an old piano at home. But something tragic had happened. Years before she began coming to the station, Sophie and her parents had been in a terrible car accident. The accident took the lives of both her parents, and Sophie herself was left badly injured. The part of her body most affected was not visible. The accident left her unable to speak. Doctors explained that she could still understand everything perfectly, but her voice was gone. Her ability to form words had been lost. For a long time, Sophie withdrew from everyone. She didn't go out, didn't play music, and didn't share what she was feeling. Her world became very small and quiet. But one day, while sorting through her grandfather's old belongings, she found a worn sheet of music. It was the forgotten melody, a piece she had never seen before but felt instantly drawn to. Something about that melody spoke to her in a way nothing else had. It reminded her of comfort, of warmth, of family. And so, slowly, Sophie sat down at her old piano at home and began to teach herself the melody. At first it was difficult. Her fingers trembled, and many notes sounded wrong, but she kept trying, playing it over and over again until she knew every note by heart. It became her voice. When she couldn't speak her feelings in words, she expressed them through that melody. That was why she began coming to the train station. It wasn't just about remembering her grandfather. It was her way of reconnecting to the world, a world she had shut out for so long. Music became the bridge between Sophie and the people around her, and though she never said a word, everyone who listened to her music felt what she was trying to say. When regular visitors learned this part of her story, their respect for her deepened. They understood that her music wasn't just beautiful, it was brave. Each time she sat at that old piano, she was doing something remarkable. She was communicating without speech, healing her own heart while helping others heal too. A mother who often came with her young daughter said quietly, "Her silence makes her music feel even more powerful. I think that's why so many of us come back. It's like she's telling a story we all understand." Even without words, even the workers at the station felt this change. One cleaner who usually swept the floor near the piano said, before she played, "This station just felt busy and noisy. Now it feels like a place where people come to feel something real." Sophie's silence became her strength. She didn't need to explain anything or give interviews. The music said it all. And every day, as people gathered around the piano, they began to understand a quiet but important truth. Even without words, we can still connect. still heal, still express love and memory. Sophie had taken her pain and turned it into a gift for everyone. A melody that made people stop, listen, and feel deeply. Her silence had not made her invisible, it had made her unforgettable. And as long as she kept coming to that old piano, the crowd would keep gathering, not just to hear the forgotten melody, but to honor the quiet, brave girl who played it. It had become part of the station's life. Each day, Sophie would arrive, quietly, carrying her small bag with care. She would sit at the old piano, run her fingers lightly over its keys as if greeting an old friend, and begin to play. Her melody always felt the same but somehow different each time. The way she played made people feel as though she was speaking directly to them, even though she never said a word. The piano itself seemed alive again. The old wood, worn and scratched, glowed warmly under the soft afternoon light. But something about Sophie had started to change. The regular visitors who came every day noticed that her face looked a little pale. Her hands trembled slightly when she placed them on the piano keys. She smiled less and stayed only for short moments after playing. The crowd could feel it. Something was different. Even the workers at the station grew concerned. One of them quietly asked, "Is she okay? She seems weaker these days." But no one really knew. Sophie remained as silent as ever. Her only language was still her music. Then, one evening, as the sun's rays turned golden through the station windows, Sophie came and sat at the piano. As usual, the crowd was larger than ever that day. Many had heard about her story and traveled from far away just to hear the melody in person. The atmosphere felt heavy but peaceful. People waited quietly as she took a deep breath and placed her fingers gently on the keys. And then she began to play. This time her touch was even softer. But there was more feeling in every note. Each sound seemed to hang in the air just a little longer. The melody wrapped around everyone who listened, holding them in a gentle embrace. Some closed their eyes as tears ran down their cheeks. Others simply stood still, listening deeply. Sophie's music carried something more that evening, as if she knew it was special, as if she was saying goodbye without saying a word. Her hands moved carefully, slowly, but beautifully. Even though she looked tired, her heart was fully in the music. When she reached the final note, there was a long pause. The sound echoed gently and then faded. Sophie sat still for a moment. Then something unexpected happened. She lifted her head and smiled, a soft, peaceful smile that many had never seen before. And just as she did, her head gently bowed, and her hand slid from the keys. She leaned forward slightly, resting against the piano. The crowd remained completely silent. At first, no one knew what was happening. Then a woman near the front whispered, "Is she all right?" A station worker stepped forward carefully and called for help. Paramedics arrived quickly and surrounded Sophie, checking her gently. The entire crowd watched quietly. Holding their breath, the paramedics lifted Sophie carefully and placed her on a stretcher. Even as they carried her away, her soft smile remained on her face. It was as if she had left something of herself behind with that last performance. That evening, the piano sat alone again, but it no longer felt forgotten. People, they stayed near it long after Sophie had been taken away. Some placed flowers gently on the bench, others left notes, thanking her for what she had given them. Word spread quickly that something serious had happened to Sophie. The next day, the space around the piano was filled with flowers, candles, and small drawings from children who had listened to her music. The train station felt different, quieter, softer, as if it was holding its breath along with the people who waited for news. Though no official word came that day, many in the crowd felt they already knew. Sophie's final performance had been her farewell, but even though she was gone, her music remained. People played recordings of her melody on their phones and shared them with friends. Some visitors brought their own instruments and played gentle songs near the piano in her honor. The old piano, once a forgotten object in the corner of a busy train station, had become a symbol, a reminder of one quiet girl's courage, of how she took her pain and turned it into something beautiful for the world. And as long as people gathered around it, her melody lived on. That evening, as the station lights dimmed and the crowds thinned, one elderly man who had always stood close by placed his hand gently on the piano. He whispered softly, "Thank you, Sophie." Even without words, she had spoken to so many, and her final performance would be remembered, not with applause, but with quiet tears and grateful hearts. The days after Sophie's final performance felt different at the train station. The corner where she had played was now a place of quiet reflection. Travelers still passed through, trains still arrived and departed, but people paused more often. Now, the piano itself remained where it had always been, but it no longer felt like just an old instrument sitting forgotten in the corner. It had become a symbol, a reminder of Sophie's music, her story, and her quiet way of touching hearts. Flowers continued to arrive every day. Children drew pictures and left them on the piano bench. Small candles flickered gently at its base. A sign was placed near the piano that read, "In memory of Sophie, whose music made the world stop and listen." Even those who had never heard Sophie play in person felt moved when they heard her story. The video of her playing the forgotten melody continued to spread online. It wasn't just a short clip anymore. People shared their personal stories along with it. stories of healing, forgiveness, and reflection. A young man wrote, "I hadn't spoken to my father in 10 years, but after listening to Sophie's music, I called him. We talked for hours." A woman shared, "I lost my mother last year. Sophie's melody made me feel like she was near again, even if only for a few moments, in a world full of noise." Sophie's gentle music created a space where people could feel and heal. The train station staff decided not to move the piano. Instead, they took extra care to keep it clean. A small plaque was added that explained a little of Sophie's story, how she had come quietly each day, how she played without words, and how her music brought strangers together. Musicians from different places began visiting. Some played their own soft tunes at the piano in honor of Sophie. Others played the forgotten melody, each note reminding those who listened of the quiet girl who had changed the atmosphere of the station. Even local schools brought children to hear the story. Teachers would point to the piano and tell them about Sophie, about her silence, her courage, and how her music connected people. For many, Sophie's story became a lesson about kindness and presence. It showed how one person, even without speaking, could make a difference simply by sharing something honest from their heart. The old man who had recognized the melody continued to visit. Each afternoon, he would sit quietly near the piano, listening as others tried to play Sophie's song. Sometimes, he would close his eyes, as if remembering the past. At other times, he would softly hum along. And though Sophie was gone, it was clear she was still present in that place. Her melody lingered, not just in the air, but in the hearts of everyone who had heard her play. Some travelers who had never met her felt drawn to the piano. Even a brief visit made them pause, think, and reflect on their own stories. The piano was no longer just a place for music. It was a place for connection. It was a place for remembering that even a stranger's quiet song could reach deep into another person's heart. The train station, once known only for its noise and hurry, had become a place where people gathered not just to travel, but to feel. And all of it began with a girl who had no voice but shared a melody that touched the world. Sophie's legacy was not in fame or fortune. It was in the simple truth that even small, quiet acts can change lives. Her story reminded people that everyone carries their own silent stories, and that music or any honest expression can help us understand one another. In time, a mural was painted on the station wall. It showed Sophie sitting at the piano, her head slightly bowed, fingers gently touching the keys. Below the mural were words that many had come to know and believe. Even without words, we can speak to each other's hearts. And so, even though Sophie no longer sat at the piano, her presence remained. Her forgotten melody had become unforgettable. It played quietly in the minds of those who passed through the station, and as long as people stopped, listened, and felt something true in their hearts, Sophie's gift would live on.